Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt and the most famous woman in history. A seductress of powerful men, she eliminated all who stood in her way, especially members of her own family. In this ancient tomb, scientists have found the bones of a young woman. They tell a tale of incest, intrigue, and murder. And the evidence leads to one person. Cleopatra, portrait of a killer. This is Ephesus, a Roman provincial capital 10 times the size of Pompeii. It can be found in modern-day Turkey. Here, scientists believe they have solved an 80-year-old mystery. In 1926, inside the ancient city walls, a strangely shaped tomb was uncovered by German archaeologists. In a sarcophagus filled with water, they found human remains. The custom in Roman Ephesus was to bury the dead outside the city walls. In 500 years, there were only 4 known exceptions, and those were all men. But the sarcophagus held what looked like female bones. A significant exception, according to the classical historian Prudence Jones.
She's the only woman buried in Ephesus, in that center. This means this must be a very important tomb of a very important person.
Also hinting at her importance was the location of the tomb. As well as being inside the city walls, it was on an ancient street known as the Street of the Heroes. The Cleopatra scholar and biographer Stanley Bernstein is also struck by the position of the tomb.
To be perfectly honest, when you look at a spectacular tomb like this, in the center of a major city, and you would simply not expect that kind of honor for anything less than an extraordinarily important figure.
For nearly a century, the identity of the tomb's occupant remained a mystery. But in the summer of 2007, a team from the Austrian Archaeological Institute set about solving the riddle once and for all. Using the latest forensic science, they think they may have cracked the case. This, they now believe, could be the body of Princess Arsinoe IV, the younger sister of Cleopatra. The sisters had 2 brothers. The Ptolemies were a troubled royal family. One issue above all divided them: how they should deal with the new superpower of the age, Rome.
In 51 BC, Egypt was in a precarious position politically. The Ptolemies really face a dilemma. If they go against the Romans, they risk losing everything, being conquered and completely annexed by the Romans. And under those circumstances, Egyptians might be brought to Rome as slaves. The Romans might insert themselves as the new dynasty of pharaohs. If, however, they appease the Romans, the same thing might happen.
Because the eldest male, Ptolemy XIII, was only 10, he shared power with his sister Cleopatra, who was 18 years old. Royal custom dictated that they be united in an incestuous marriage. Cleopatra believed that Egypt's best interests lay in collaboration with the Roman Empire. Arsinoe and her brother Ptolemy disagreed.
It was a, quite frankly, impossible situation. And for Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII, relations deteriorated almost immediately.
Cleopatra tried to oust her brother, but she failed. Ptolemy had her exiled to Syria. The exiled queen saw only one route back to power: by eliminating the competition. Over time, all traces of Cleopatra and her siblings had disappeared, until now. In Ephesus in 1992, the archaeologist Hilke Thur rediscovered the forgotten tomb while excavating Roman ruins on the Street of the Heroes. In the 20 years she'd worked at Ephesus, she'd never seen anything like it. Hilke was even more intrigued when she read the original first-hand accounts from 1926 that stated that the tomb's bones were those of a woman. The chance that anything remained inside 80 years later seemed remote, but Hilke decided to reopen the tomb. It proved to be a momentous decision.
I crawled into the tomb and saw in the back there, in these two niches, were a lot of good preserved bones.
The team in 1926 apparently removed the bones from their watery resting place to preserve them, but no mention was made of putting them back.
I had always believed that the whole skeleton was not in Ephesus, that was lost. I was really excited.
When Hilke examined the ancient texts, she discovered only one woman important enough to have been buried here: Princess Arsinoe IV, Cleopatra's sister. And that wasn't all. Arsinoe had been murdered in Ephesus in 41 BC. If correct, Hilke Thur's conclusion was an archaeological bombshell.
If this is in fact Arsinoe, it's a tremendously significant find because this is the only member of Cleopatra's immediate family that we have any remains of.
But it was still only a theory. Hilke's superiors decided to bring in a team of independent experts to put it to the test. Led by the forensic anthropologist Fabian Kantz, their job would be to play devil's advocate.
Hilke had this theory that the skeleton from the octagon is Arsinoe IV, the sister of Cleopatra. And our job was to disprove this theory.
Fabian's first task was to re-examine the tomb for more evidence. He made a startling discovery.
In this niche over the door to the grave chamber, there have been some bones. It turned out that there's human bones and that they belong to the individual from the grave chamber. The chance to find additional bones in this grave was nearly nothing, I think. It was a great day.
Fabian's tests proved the new bones matched those of the old skeleton. They were uncontaminated, ideal scientific samples. His first hurdle was to verify they were the bones of a woman. If not, Hilke's theory would have been disproved. In human bone tissue, there is a gap called the sciatic notch, which is much wider in females than in males, to enable childbearing.
If we take the pelvic bone from the individual, from the octagon, we can see morphologically it's definitely a female.
So the skeleton was the right sex to be Cleopatra's sister Arsinoe. The next hurdle was to verify the skeleton's age.
The scientific dating of the bones is done with radiocarbon dating. This gave us an age from 200 BC to 20 BC. I think this is striking, because the carbon dating was consistent with being Arsinoe.
The dating coincided with the reign of the Ptolemies.
The pickers are out looking for
really cool, dirty, rad stuff.
When I see that thing in that natural state, that's what gets my juices flowing.
This old soda fountain piece, to me it looks like it's real early, like 1910, 1920.
Will these juices make Mike the king of cola?
I was thinking $500.
$500?
Or will he fall flat?
It's kind of like Indiana Jones meets Sanford and Son.
American Pickers, Friday at 8:30 on History.
It was the TV comedy that broke the mold.
The only way to survive was practical joking, was sending up the military.
But for the real mobile medics, the brutality of Korea was no laughing matter.
I did amputation after amputation. It was more like butchery than surgery.
So it isn't all funny stuff going on. A lot of serious moments, too.
The Real MASH, coming soon on History.
Δροσερές. Απολαυστικές. Απίθανες. Φανταστικές. Οικογενειακές στιγμές. Family Zone. Ταινίες με απίθανη οικογενειακή γεύση. Κάθε Σάββατο με 2 ταινίες από τις 3:30 το απόγευμα. Αποκλειστικά στο Nova Cinema 2.
Αγαπημένη μου Τασία, εγκαταλείπω κάθε προσπάθεια.
Άμα σε λύσω,
Πιστή υποταγή.
από αυτή τη στιγμή να λαμβάνεις το μωρό. Θα βρούμε τη μάνα να το δώσουμε πίσω.
Είσαι με τα καλά σου. Εγώ δεν αφήνω την Περσεφόνη.
Πόσα είναι?
Τόσο.
Μια φορά και ένα μωρό στις 17 Μαρτίου από την Village.
I could see the ship sink, and I could hear people yelling, calling their mother.
They said that he was missing in action and said they never found his dog tags.
The numbers in the water got less and less. People had had enough, they just threw their arms in the air and went under.
Terrible waste of men's lives.
Deep Sea Saturdays. Every Saturday from 8:30 on History.
2,000 years ago, Egypt's royal family, the Ptolemies, were battling each other for the throne. On one side was Cleopatra, on the other her 2 brothers, and her sister Arsinoe. Egypt's stability was important to Rome, so this family feud threatened Roman interests. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria and tried to reconcile the warring Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII. Cleopatra stole back from exile and employed her famous cunning to get Caesar on her side before her brother's arrival.
Caesar wanted to see her. It was getting past the Egyptian guards that was more of the trick.
The Roman historian Plutarch recorded what happened next.
As it was impossible to escape notice otherwise, she stretched herself full length inside a bed sack tied up with a cord and was carried inside to Caesar.
It is said that this device of Cleopatra's was what first captivated Caesar, for she showed herself to be a bold seductress.
She met Caesar in his personal quarters that had been given to him in the palace. This was a very personal meeting, and she was able to use her great personal charisma to influence Caesar, as well as her considerable political acumen.
What Cleopatra said once in Caesar's presence was also recorded by Roman historians. She begged him to end her exile and restore her to the throne. And she knew just how to convince him. In Ephesus, the Austrian team was struck by the size of the bones from the tomb.
Bone is not a static tissue. It's a very dynamic tissue. And if you are heavy, the bone become thicker and more robust, and the skeleton was very slim, so it cannot be from a very heavy person. It's 100% sure that it was a light person.
The only image that exists of Cleopatra in Dendera, Egypt, depicts her as being thin. Plutarch's account that she was small enough to be smuggled in bedclothes seems to corroborate this. Could this shared attribute with the female skeleton found in the tomb lend more weight to Hilkertür's theory?
The portraits, particularly the coin portraits of a number of the earlier Ptolemies, quite frankly show people who are obese. The sense that Cleopatra doesn't share the physical size of her predecessors might suggest that there's a difference in bloodline, that she might not be fully a Ptolemy.
Whatever her bloodline, Cleopatra's looks famously captivated Caesar. On their very first night together, they sealed their alliance in bed. When her brother Ptolemy arrived for his reconciliation the next day, he realized he'd been outmaneuvered. Stung by the betrayal, he fled the palace to raise support. This was the moment when the legend of Cleopatra was born, and it's one that has captivated the world ever since.
Smart, sexy women who succeed in a world of men are always interesting, and she is probably the most spectacular ancient example of it.
No physical evidence of Cleopatra or any other Ptolemy has ever been found. If the skeleton is indeed Cleopatra's sister Arsinoe, we could get a glimpse of how Egypt's last pharaoh herself might have looked. But here the forensic team reached a dead end. There was no skull. When archaeologists first excavated the tomb in 1926, they took the skull back to Germany. They hoped to study it and perhaps identify its owner. Unfortunately, the skull was lost in the aftermath of the Second World War and has never been found again. But the original notes, photographs, and measurements of the skull did survive. Using them and the latest scientific technology, a world-renowned facial reconstruction team tried to rebuild the skull and even the face. Caroline Wilkinson led the team.
Well, this has been a challenge, but it's been quite interesting to take in these two-dimensional images and recreate a 3D model within the planes created by the images. We can take a template skull of a similar age, sex and ethnicity into the space and then alter that to fit the morphology, the shape that you can see of the skull on the images.
But it's unclear what this 3D reconstruction can reveal about the identity of its owner.
The eye sockets are quite large in relation to the upper face, and that's something that's quite common in children. It's also something that's common in young females, but I think proportionally the cranium suggests this is a young adult. It's difficult to call a skull beautiful, but certainly it's symmetrical, it's balanced, it's got quite delicate features, and those are all things you would associate with a beautiful face.
The age and proportions of the skull are consistent with what's known about Arsinoe, and by extension her more famous sister. But analysis of the skull throws up a startling revelation about the ancestry of its owner. Until recently, the Ptolemies were thought to be Greek, but some scholars have begun to theorize that Cleopatra and her siblings were mixed race.
The distance from the forehead to the back of the skull is long in relation to the overall height of the cranium, And that's something that you see quite frequently in certain populations, one of which is ancient Egyptians. Another would be black African groups. It could suggest a mixture of ancestry.
If this is Arsinoe, Caroline Wilkinson's finding agrees with the recent theories that Cleopatra had African blood. But the team still needed to prove that this was Arsinoe. Would the tomb and burial chamber provide the vital evidence?
Take a front row seat in the theatre of war. A view from the front line. Weekdays at 5 on History.
Μπάλα στο γκολ και σουτ γκολ. Θέλει να βρει το χώρο να φέρει την μπάλα στο αριστερό. Το έκανε το σουτ 2-1 από τον Πορτογάλο. Μπάλα στο δοκάνι και τα δίχτυα. 1-2 Φουστέρ. Το σουτ γκολ. 3-1 στο 75. Τζιμπρίλ Σισέ.
4 μεγάλοι στάρ στα γήπεδα της Super League. Απολαύστε το Μάρτιο αγώνες που έφεραν την προσωπική τους υπογραφή. Super League Stars. Κάθε Παρασκευή από τις 7 το απόγευμα, αποκλειστικά στο Nova Sports 1.
Οι ταινίες που αγαπήσαμε έχουν τη δική τους κινηματογραφική ζώνη. Back to the Classics. Κάθε τρίτο βράδυ με 2 ταινίες. Αποκλειστικά στο Nova Cinema 2.
On CI.
More than 2/3 of us die without leaving a will.
This estate could be worth an awful lot of money.
It's a mission for the heir hunters.
We want phone numbers of these people. It's not all about the money. Sorry to have woken you.
They stop at nothing.
Where do you want to go? Get to Edinburgh.
In the race to trace.
We've got a possible brother.
Before the government bag the cash.
They're going to receive hundreds of thousands of pounds.
Mission accomplished.
Couldn't believe it.
Heir Hunters. Weeknights at 6:45 on History.
In Egypt in 48 BC, Cleopatra and the Ptolemaic dynasty were in crisis. Cleopatra's elopement with Caesar was seen as a betrayal of Egypt and her brother and co-regent Ptolemy XIII. It provoked a national outcry against the Romans.
When Ptolemy discovers what Cleopatra has done, discovers that she has ingratiated herself to Caesar, that really sparks the military conflict known as the Alexandrian War, which is Ptolemy trying to throw the Romans out of Egypt.
Troops loyal to Ptolemy and Arsinoe took up arms and besieged the palace where Caesar had made his headquarters.
From Caesar's point of view, he had found himself in the middle of a hornet's nest. When he had come in, he had made too obvious that he was Roman power personified.
To prevent Arsinoe and Ptolemy from leading a loyalist uprising, Caesar took both of them hostage.
The last thing he wanted to do was lose control of the royal family, so that Arsinoe, Cleopatra, Ptolemy XIII, and their brother were all potential pawns in the power struggle, and he needed to keep control of all of them.
Caesar, trapped in Alexandria, seized the one building that controlled supplies in and out of Alexandria's harbour, the Pharos Lighthouse. It was a landmark of huge strategic significance. It was also a symbol of the Ptolemies' power. The Pharos would prove to be a critical link in the investigation taking place in the 21st century. In Turkey, members of the Austrian team turned their attention from the bones to the tomb itself. Only the burial chamber and octagonal base remained intact. The rest consisted of 170 scattered stone fragments. But luckily, there was an exception. One facade of the tomb had survived from the first excavation in 1904. It had been shipped back to Vienna, where it was on display. It's the only piece that gives a sense of just how enormous the tomb was. It provides more proof about the identity of the person buried in the tomb. Nothing like it exists anywhere else in Ephesus.
These pieces have been found right beside the octagon. It must have been something like a torch, probably, where you can put up a light in the top of this little column. So it looks like a bundle of papyrus leaves, you know, from Egypt. As an image, as the type of this column, everyone would recognize at once papyrus bundle and Egypt.
But the iconography only tells a small part of the story. To see the full picture, the whole tomb had to be rebuilt. Virtually. To conduct this new phase of the investigation, a third team of Austrians was brought in. These forensic engineers spent 5 years examining each fragment, scanning them into a powerful computer and rebuilding the tomb in virtual reality, piece by piece.
This is just kind of a of stones right here. It's kind of a virtual stone yard.
Detailed scanning of one of the stones revealed a clue, a tiny 2,000-year-old scribble of the tomb's outline, barely visible to the eye.
This potentially is a drawing of the octagon itself. This is the base, the columns, and the roof on top of it. Nobody knew about this drawing up to this summer.
Finding this ancient Roman graffiti was a breakthrough. It reinforced Hilke's theory, and the Austrian engineers had proof that they were on the right track. The tomb was massive, 50 feet high and 13 feet wide. It had been topped with a pyramid. In its day, it would have been one of the city's most prominent landmarks. Hilke searched in vain for anything else that was like it in the Roman world at this time. But she did identify a structure that bore a striking resemblance to the tomb, a building 1,000 miles away in Egypt.
A monument which has a square base, then an octagonal section, certainly echoes, if nothing else, the Pharos. It's the only prominent octagonal-shaped building that anyone in antiquity would think of.
The 300-foot lighthouse was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. From the top of it, sentries could see 30 miles out to sea. At night, mariners could spot the landmark from even further away. Workmen stoked giant fires to keep the lighthouse torch burning.
The Pharos is Alexandria's Statue of Liberty. It's the signature monument. It really was the symbol of the city and symbol of the dynasty.
The story of Arsinoe and the Pharos were about to become linked in an epic chapter of history. In the autumn of 48 BC, with the lighthouse at Alexandria under his command, Caesar thought he controlled the city. But the young princess Arsinoe was about to turn the tables in what became known as the Battle of Alexandria. She made a dramatic escape from the palace and was whisked away to join the Egyptian forces, loyal to her and her brother, who was still a captive.
For Arsinoe, escaping from the palace offered her the chance, quite frankly, to replace Cleopatra.
With no time to lose after her escape from Alexandria, Arsinoe launched a daring attack to take control of the Pharos lighthouse back from Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. Taken by surprise and overwhelmed by the ferocity of the assault, the Roman line broke. Caesar's troops fled from the lighthouse. Overrun by Arsinoe's forces, Caesar was in a desperate position.
He had to jump into the Mediterranean to escape being killed. He lost his cloak, barely escaped being killed. It's one of those moments when history could literally have changed had things gone the other direction, a minute or two the other direction, and Caesar might have been history, literally.
Arsinoe's forces had won the day, and the symbol of her victory was the Pharos lighthouse.
It's humiliating for Caesar. Caesar never claimed so close to being destroyed.
The Egyptians proudly displayed Caesar's cloak as a trophy, while Caesar himself retreated to the palace and Cleopatra.
Cleopatra would have been terrified. Her entire hope for success depended on Caesar winning.
Caesar sent for reinforcements. Ptolemy XIII, still a hostage, convinced Caesar that he could appease the rebels. Stalling for time, Caesar released him. But the young king immediately joined forces with Arsinoe against Caesar and Cleopatra. Roman reinforcements were on their way from Syria. Ptolemy led an army to stop them at the border, but the Romans caught him by surprise. With Cleopatra's full support, they ran Ptolemy down when he was crossing the Nile. The young pharaoh drowned, trying to escape. Cleopatra had eliminated her first obstacle, her husband and brother, without lifting a finger. With Ptolemy dead, the Roman reinforcements drove on to Alexandria. Arsinoe, Queen of Egypt one moment, was taken prisoner the next.
For the rest of the family, Cleopatra and Caesar's victory meant the end, in a sense, of their immediate hopes. Arsinoe became a trophy. She had been the symbol of resistance. She now became Caesar's trophy of victory.
In 21st century Ephesus, the Austrian forensic team was pushing ahead with its investigation. They were trying to determine how old the female skeleton was when she died.
This is the bone, the femur, the right femur from the lady from the octagon. The bone is not fully developed. It's in more than one piece, and in between there is the growing plate where the bone is growing like this, which means she's still growing.
By measuring this gap between the unfused bone, Fabian can go on to calculate the age of the deceased to an accuracy of within 2 years.
She was quite young, 15 to 17.
No record of Arsinoe's birth date exists, but we do know she was Cleopatra's younger sister. Since Cleopatra was 21 when she met Julius Caesar, Fabian's conclusion is absolutely consistent with this skeleton being Arsinoe. The teenage Arsinoe remained a prisoner in Alexandria. Julius Caesar restored Cleopatra to power in 47 BC, and according to an ancient Roman historian, married her to her surviving brother, Ptolemy XIV. Arsinoe was taken to Rome by Caesar as a symbol of his triumph in Egypt. The tradition was for captured leaders to be paraded in chains. In 46 BC, the trophy on display was Arsinoe. Behind her was a burning effigy of the Pharos lighthouse.
They have symbols that allow the audience to understand what is happening. And of course, the Pharos, as the signature monument of Ptolemaic Egypt, would immediately alert the audience to what Caesar had captured.
At the climax of the parade, the high-profile prisoner was traditionally strangled in front of the crowd.
Caesar took a risk, of course, when he paraded Arsinoe. Unlike his other great trophies during this parade, Arsinoe was a child. She certainly can't have been more than her middle teens, if that. For the audience, it was simply hard to get over the fact that they weren't looking at a terrible enemy of Rome. They were looking at a girl who, quite frankly, might be as old as one of their daughters.
Fearing that he would lose the crowd's support, Caesar broke with tradition and spared Arsinoe. But on one condition: she would be banished from Egypt forever. In Ephesus, Hilke, who rediscovered the bones in the Pharos-shaped tomb in 2007, met with Fabian Cans to see how the forensic examination was progressing. Although she'd seen the bones, she'd never held them before.
Yeah, this is a great feeling to touch a bone, and especially to touch a bone of a historical person. And especially if it's such a famous person as a sister of Cleopatra.
Yet another piece of forensic evidence bolsters Hilke's theory that the tomb's occupant was Arsinoe IV. Physical stress from hard labor or disease creates stress marks, or Harris lines, that are visible on X-rays.
They are really very, very smooth.
There haven't been much labor to this bone, or not a lot of physical activity with this person, and so the bone, the surface of the bone, keeps smooth.
It fits very well to our theory, because I think she didn't have the possibility to be very active.
The scientific puzzle seemed to be falling into place. But what does the historical record tell us? In 46 BC, Arsinoe was banished to a haven for rich political refugees, the Temple of Artemis. And the Temple of Artemis was in Roman Ephesus. It was not the life Arsinoe would have chosen, but she would be safe in exile in this sacred place. Today, the Temple of Artemis, or the Artemision as it was once known, is a pile of rubble on dry land. But when Arsinoe was exiled here on Caesar's orders, it, like the Pharos lighthouse in Alexandria, was one of the 7 wonders of the world. The sea reached right up to its walls. It was enormous. Over 400 feet long, 236 feet wide, and 100 feet high. It was made almost entirely of marble. This temple was renowned as a place where people could take refuge.
It was a common practice that you may ask for political asylum here in the Artemision of Ephesus.
The Artemision was under the protection of the Greek goddess, Artemis.
She protected the city of Ephesus. This was, I think, most of the important things of Artemis, but she was also a goddess over life, death, and birth. She was protecting women, also animals.
Because of the goddess, The temple had special status.
You could stay here as long as you want. People lived here for years, for decades, and they were safe because the Artemision had its own administration and had its own jurisdiction. So nobody was allowed to interfere in the Artemision.
But barely a year into her exile, Arsinoe's safety at the Artemision was thrown into doubt. The man who had spared her, Julius Caesar, was murdered in March 44 BC. Arsinoe was suddenly vulnerable. And she wasn't the only one. It was then that Cleopatra revealed her ruthlessness. Within weeks of Caesar's death, she had her last remaining brother, Ptolemy XIV, poisoned. Only one member of her immediate family, one last potential claimant to the throne, remained alive, and that was Arsinoe.
Even though Arsinoe doesn't seem like that much of a threat, Cleopatra can look to her own family history and know that for security, you have to eliminate threats before they become a real problem.
The last threat was 1,000 miles away, but alive. No ancient visual representation exists of Arsinoe's face. Using the original measurements of her skull, the facial reconstruction team spent much time rebuilding it. From the shape of the skull and the bite of the upper jaw, Caroline Wilkinson estimated the appearance of the lower jaw, recreating the mouth and muscles on the face.
We all have the same muscles in our face, and they all have exactly the same origins and exactly the same attachment points. But because the bony structure of the skull is different for each of us, it's just the shape and proportions of the skull that make a different face shape. We can then look at facial feature details. We can look at the bones on the edge of the nasal aperture and the nasal root here between the eyes to tell us about the prominence and width and shape of the nose.
We can tell that she had a very prominent nasal root, kind of like ancient Greek sculpture, that kind of classical nose shape.
It's obviously something that was recognisable from that period of time. And I think it's something that now we find aesthetically pleasing. It's a beautiful feature.
The position of the nose, starting directly between her eyebrows, was a desirable feature in antiquity, and a feature known to have been possessed by the Ptolemies. The Austrian team never imagined that they would come face to face with the occupant of the tomb. But by combining the data with the latest bone reconstruction technology, Caroline was able to build the first anatomically accurate representation of a Ptolemy. This was its unveiling.
This is really cool.
It's great. It's a really good replica of the photographs.
Yeah, you really have the feeling to look in the face of the person. It's really a very, very strange feeling to have the skull of her in your hands. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, perfect.
The pickers are out looking for
really cool, dirty, rad stuff.
When I see that thing in that natural state, that's what gets my juices flowing.
This old soda fountain piece, to me it looks like it's real early, like 1910, 1920.
Will these juices make Mike the king of cola?
I was thinking $500.
$500?
Or will he fall flat?
It's kind of like Indiana Jones meets Sanford and Son.
American Pickers, Friday at 8:30 on History.
How dare you the dagger is aware of what's happening. Did you see that?
Life on the ice road is never easy.
Watch out now! Watch it! Whoa! Oh
Tiredness can kill,
I am so flippin' tired. This is how guys get killed out here.
but so can a head-on collision.
I don't want to bleed to death.
Look at me. Look at me, Garth.
Just another day for the Ice Road Truckers. Monday at 8:30 on History, made every day.
In 43 BC, Ephesus came under the control of a new Roman governor, Mark Antony. His expensive lifestyle and military campaigns quickly bankrupted the province, and he cast his eye across the sea to the wealth of Egypt and its queen.
Antony and Cleopatra's meeting is, of course, one of the great set pieces in world literature.
With Antony, Cleopatra is a bit older, a bit more politically experienced, and she's much more upfront about wanting to gain the upper hand with Antony.
Cleopatra sailed to Tarsus, now in Turkey, in 41 BC. At a feast, the two struck up the rudiments of a deal. He would be able to pay his debts and continue to live the good life. She would receive his protection. There was one sure way to make the deal binding.
Sex is part of a political negotiation. For Antony, what he, of course, needed was confirmation of Cleopatra's reliability and the resources of Egypt.
Cleopatra had her own agenda.
Now, Cleopatra may also be thinking, as she sees how she can captivate Antony, that she may now be able to go after Arsinoe, because Antony, as the master of the East, has Arsinoe in his territory.
We can imagine what happened during the night. What we do know happened the following day was that Cleopatra got pretty much everything she asked for.
That meant time was running out for Arsinoe. In modern-day Ephesus, the forensic anthropologist Fabian Kantz had one last challenge: to establish the cause of death of the young woman from the octagonal tomb. There was no evidence of any pathologies or trace of disease in the bones.
I think she was quite healthy at the time of death. I think she died a sudden death. I'm pretty sure she died a sudden death, but what caused the death, we don't know.
The historical records leave no doubt that Arsinoe died suddenly. Ancient historians were also clear about who was responsible. According to two accounts, Mark Antony had her dragged from the Temple of Artemis, where she was murdered on Cleopatra's orders.
It
was not only a shock in Ephesus, it was a shock in Rome and everywhere, you know. It was unbelievable that somebody interferes in a sanctuary, and especially in the Artemision of Ephesus. It was the biggest crime in this period.
Arsinoe's murder fits Cleopatra's needs because it eliminates the last possible rival. Cleopatra doesn't seem to be a person who tolerated risk easily.
But Cleopatra couldn't erase her sister completely. Like a secret code, the tomb and skeleton have ensured that one day Arsinoe's story would be decoded. Archaeologists now believe that it has been decoded beyond doubt, and some of the most prominent scholars in the world have confirmed their results. The position of the tomb at the center of Ephesus, its shape, a model of the Pharos lighthouse, and scientific scrutiny of the skeleton and skull all confirm the identity of Arsinoe IV. Only one last piece of the puzzle remains. What did Arsinoe, the sister of Cleopatra, actually look like? The final computer renderings were finished in Britain, and Prudence Jones travelled 4,000 miles to see the first ever scientific representation of Cleopatra's closest relative.
This looks like a real person. You can really see some distinctive features. She would have had certainly a distinctive nose and lip shape, her eyes. So you do feel like you're actually looking at someone's face.
I think she's got an aesthetically pleasing face. And she's an interesting combination as well, because she's got this long skull shape, which you often see with ancient Egyptians, and then she's got this kind of classical nose that you would associate more with a European group.
The skull suggests someone of partly African descent, rather than the white European face which has been associated with Cleopatra's family for centuries. This will force experts to reconsider how Cleopatra herself looked. 11 years after Arsinoe's murder, Cleopatra's ruthless political maneuverings caught up with her. She and her lover, Mark Antony, lost a power struggle to take over the Roman Empire. Defeated in battle, they committed suicide. The Ptolemaic dynasty died with Cleopatra. By eliminating Arsinoe and her brothers, she ensured that there were no more direct descendants of her father left to assume the throne. The age of the pharaohs was over. Egypt became a province of Rome. This skeleton is the first ever physical evidence of Cleopatra's, probably the closest we'll ever get to an image of Cleopatra in the flesh. What it shows is that she wasn't just a cunning politician, a beautiful queen, a skilled seductress. It paints a very different picture from romantic legend. It paints the portrait of a killer.
On Sunday nights, history turns ancient. A special season uncovering the civilizations of the past.
This was the moment where the science of archaeology was born.
We journey back to investigate the people and the legends that forged them.
The tomb was not visited by any except the spirit of the pharaoh and of the gods.
Ancient Sunday,